St. Paul. While you're here, kind of like while you're up, right? Yeah. No, it's good. Well, I mean, and like Dan has said, like our AV setup and the way we're able to live stream is really exemplary. So like for other churches to be able to see what we're doing and how we're doing it, it's, you know, we can set a good example too, right, in the ways that we do. So, I don't know if it's been 3 minutes or not since Dan left. But I guess I could put it in slide mode so we can see it better. Ta-ta. So we're getting geared up for this. All right. And as folks trickle in, we'll do what we do at the beginning of it. And just reminded that this has been an invitation to read it. And whether you've read it or not, I hope that you've enjoyed like our time and being able to kind of think about the spiritual journey in the way that he offers us in this book. So this is our conclusion for it. And again, a plug for Carol's adult forum for August about Episcopal hymnody and music. And so Carol is just a wealth and font of knowledge, so I'm looking forward to attending her classes. And August 20th will be our ministry fair. And so she'll have our classes in August, but August 20th will be the ministry fair. So if there's things that you've been wondering about the various ministries in the church, that's kind of like your day to kind of, not speed date, but kind of get a quick overview of all the different ministries and our various ministry leaders for whom we're so thankful. So since we added a thought bubble last week about Charleston's, the book being in Charleston's voice and it being a relational read, which I think is especially important in these last couple of chapters to remember, I liked what he said in the chapter. He was like, you know, because he's had these spiritual insights and he's had these prayers, he's like, that doesn't make me special. He's like, I'm common. Like everybody could have these spiritual experiences. Everybody can have the access to spirit in prayer in this way. So I thought that's just a reminder that he doesn't like elevate himself because he's an Episcopal priest, because he's been a bishop, because even he's an indigenous elder, that he is a person who's willing to engage in spirit and prayer. He can have these insights, and he's saying they're readily available to everyone. So again, our ladder to the light, the last two chapters are renewal and transformation. And I liked, rather than me summarizing on that, on page 149 to 150, he offers a summary of the ladder. So remember, we start at the bottom. We're in the Kiva room, the room underground. So we start at the bottom and then ascend. He says, through the chapters of this book, we have climbed the ladder of spiritual awareness. It was not easy. Our climb begins before dawn, deep in the fertile darkness of the Kiva, the womb of our faith. Embracing that faith, acceptance of the Spirit's presence in our lives, we began our ascent. So along the way, we received the Spirit's blessing. We began to hope, and by so doing, we released into the world a power greater than fear. We did away with old prejudices in the light of that hope, and we became a community of diversity and inclusion. We became active agents of change. We found the courage to tell the truth. Finally, we felt the renewal of our hearts and minds as we stepped up to embody the light we sought to see, but now have become. So that's like in two paragraphs, like the whole book basically summed up right there for you. The rest of the book has just been kind of filling in the blanks of each of those rungs of the ladder. But does that resonate with you know, his accurate description of that? And I wonder, you don't have to share it out loud unless you want to, but like where in your faith right now do you think that you are in that, on that ladder? You know, like are you just grounding your faith? Are you becoming more cognizant of the presence of the Spirit? Are you in you know, kind of feeding your hope, looking for hope? Are you working on telling the truth? we're trying to think about action, building up community, and then we'll talk more about the renewal and transformation today. And I think that it's important to remember too that, like he mentions towards the end of the book, like it's an up and down thing. Like it's not just one and done kind of thing. Susan, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I was going to say I'm all over the place.
Yeah.
I'm coming up the ladder. I don't ever get to the top, but I'm getting all, going up and going down, up and down.
So for those of us who might be listening online, Susan's all over the place and going up and down and reiterating the point that it's not like we don't just climb the ladder once and ta-da, we're good. And I think that resonates with all the religious traditions and faith traditions, that it's not like, you achieve enlightenment or have an experience of nirvana and you just stay there for forever. That it's a moment. And we might, go up and down this ladder a couple times a day, maybe, depending on what the company we keep and the experiences that we're having, right? I hope not. That sounds awfully exhausting. James, there's a comment in the back. Yep, right here.
Could you explain how hope helps us see more clearly on step 7?
Okay. Yep, we're going to get to that because renewal is what we're focusing on today. Sort of. I'm going to go ahead and insert. This is not in my notes, but maybe it is somewhere for me. I thought these were some of his most discombobulated chapters in the whole. I don't know if you all might have read them and had moments of clarity and insight, but I really felt like he was just pouring information that he wanted us to have and concepts that he wanted us to have, and it didn't really have a good narrative flow to it, and so it wasn't as clear and concise, and maybe it's just my brain that's discombobulated, maybe I'm projecting, but I felt like he has a lot of information and a lot of points that we could just take in and of themselves, but I felt like he was kind of reaching a little bit to keep us on that Kiva ladder. But it all comes together, it's all related, but that's just my impression of these last couple of chapters. So if you didn't feel that way, great. If you did feel that way, you're not alone. But let's return to this rung of renewal so we can get to, and remember your question, if we don't touch on it, flag me down again, okay? All right, everybody, are we good to go? Okay. So the rung of renewal. He starts out talking about the Kiva Lodge and the Sweat Lodge comparison. And both he's saying, and these are just a couple of historic images I found online, the top one being the Kiva and the bottom one being a sweat lodge. Have any of you ever done a sweat lodge before? A couple, 3? Okay, awesome. I haven't, but I have gone someplace where a retreat where they had one set up, and it was very much the poles bent and the canvas or leather, whatever they use to put over it. And they're not, some of them are bigger. From the images that I saw online, some of them could be made to be a lot bigger to accommodate more comfortably the people that are within them. But the intention in going to either of these places, if you go into the Kiva, remember it's a place of prayer. You go with a prayerful intention. And if you go into the Sweat Lodge, he says it's a place of exchange. And so we're letting go of something to make room for something else. So what we could think superficially, we're going to a sweat lodge, we're just going to sweat it out, right? Let go of those calories so we can come out renewed and refreshed. But the sweat lodge is really, he talks, that place of exchange and renewal. So we're letting go of, physically, letting go of the clothing that we wear. But he also says, letting go of our presumptions, letting go of our attachments, letting go of our preconceived notions of what we think Spirit might need to be saying to us or what our religions tell us that we need to be doing. Let go of everything and come in unburdened, unbound. And then we're letting go so that we can make room to encounter the Spirit here. And so our exchange, he says, we're exchanging that darkness for light. We're going into this dark womb-like place and we're experiencing light. But I think the exchange even starts before that. We're exchanging one idea of darkness for another. We're wherever we are in our lives, he's talked about this present darkness in the book, all the things that cause us to be worried or anxious or despairing. And so that kind of clouds us, so we can't see clearly. And so we're clouded, we're burdened, we're worried, we're in this present darkness of all the things that are bad, per se. And we're exchanging that idea of darkness, we're letting go of that so we can just abide in that darkness of the womb so it can be fertile ground. So whether we're thinking about, like the uterine-like womb of a mother, or we're thinking about just the deep in the soil, the earth itself for the seeds, like it is dark and it needs that darkness to just be. And I love that Barbara Brown Taylor, I think, talks about it beautifully in that book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, which I think I mentioned early on, when she talks about being in the cave. And when you're in the cave where you get far enough in that there is no light. And what can you see around you? Nothing. You can't see your hand in front of your face. It can be a very, a discombobulating experience, right? To not be able to see the hand that you know is in front of your face. But also, I think in that darkness, it's an experience of equilibrium. Like everything is balanced out. If we think about, that concept of everything being one or everything being nothing, like it's all in that darkness, it's kind of like a leveling ground. Anything is possible. If you think about Casey's sermon from today about the Bogarts from Harry Potter, like thinking about, what our fears, how they present or how they might present just with a shift in our imagination and intention. So the main thing about the Kiva and the Sweat Lodge is like in entering into that darkness, letting go of what might bind us or what might inhibit us from experiencing the Spirit, and then being able to receive whatever it is that we're receiving. And we'll talk more about later what that all entails, but and then we emerge from that womb-like place with deep transformation. So that's kind of, to me, it kind of takes like the whole metaphor and puts it all in one step, in a way. But we've needed all those other steps along the way for us to even be able to make that exchange at all. Does that make sense? We had to have the faith. We had to have the vision of what is possible for that to even be possible. Well, that's how I'm interpreting it. Does that jive with what you're thinking, Steve, or do others of you have other ways of looking at it, understanding it? So I really liked what how he phrased it. I mean, he says at the very beginning of this chapter anyway, that really his invitation to the reader is to be open and willing to experience this journey from the exchange of darkness to the light so that you can experience that renewal. The invitation to let go, to make space for something new and to allow for silence. I love that he puts intentionality behind it, because we're not always just wake up in the morning willing to be like, today I think I'm just going to disorganize my whole theological worldview. But we're given the invitation, like, well, if we're self-aware enough to realize that maybe we're worried or anxious about something, and maybe the current view and trajectory that we're on is only perpetuating our demise or our downfall, or just, exponentially increasing that which we're worried about, then don't we need to do something different? And so his invitation is to allow for this to happen. Yeah.
Made me think about, I was recently at a conference, and how when you're holding on to these things and you're not ready to let those things go, but you start letting yourself add some things, and then eventually some of these things might start to drift away and you're ready to start letting go. But it's okay to hold on. Like, it's okay. I'm not ready. I'm not there yet. I'm not going to let go. Mm-hmm. But start adding these things in.
Yeah, right behind you, James.
What makes me think about it is, like a drug addict or an alcoholic, they try to control it and control it and control it and control it. And then it gets so devastating. They're in the horrible darkness of life, till it's finally it says, okay, I'll let go. God, you're mine. I can't do this. You do it for me. And then life starts over again.
That, yeah.
My experience is if you impose a sensory deprivation experience on yourself, your nervous system will spontaneously self-generate stimuli. Like if you black out your eyes so you can't see anything, you'll start seeing flashes of light. And apparently that's where hope comes from.
Are you suggesting that like in a, I tend toward sarcasm and being a smart aleck, my dad tells me. And so like, I'm not putting you on the spot, but like when you say that, I think of like my husband when he tries to play like a devil's advocate for me and saying, well, you're just making this up. Like so I'm thinking like if he hears that, he might say, well, so your flashes of light are really just your physiologically, but you're talking about like really with that spiritual eye, the system. Okay. I'm recognizing there's always like two ways to look at the things. This is part of my my practice, it seems. But so yeah, I appreciate that he talks about vision and how that's what feeds our hope. So that point of encounter with us with the Spirit, when we let everything else fall away, really gives us that spark of hope. So yeah, you're on.
This may be simple, but it reminds me of something I'm a little more familiar with, which is Thomas Keating's just clearing your brain and centering prayer. So you have a word. We've talked about that somewhere recently. I don't remember where. And to actually, I even imagine my brain. This is silly, but I imagine it in concentric circles and trying to get down to that deepest part and getting the stuff, the trash, the stuff, not necessarily trash, but the stuff out of my head is very difficult. And so I understand the let go and the space for something new or the space for nothing for
Yeah.
a while.
Well, and like Parker Palmer talks about it, like our soul being like that wild animal in the woods. It only comes out when it's quiet and still, and like the fox behind the trees. And we can go tramping through the forest, making all kinds of noise, and we're going to scare everything else away. But if we sit still for long enough, then that fox, that wild animal that is like our inner knowing, our soul or whatever, that it will peek out. Timid, and easily scared, but still, that we got to let those things fall away and invite the silence to be present long enough. And so he also talks about kinship being at the core of really, I think, our individual renewal, but also our collective renewal. And that kinship, remember, being like that sense of being related to all, period. To all people, to all of creation. And that we need to remember the ancestors. He talks beautifully about our ancestors and how when we allow ourselves the spiritual vision and think about our commonalities and our communality, that the spirit realm isn't that far from us, and that the ancestors are still feeding us wisdom and wish for us well. And can help us along the way. Was there anything about the ancestors that spoke to any of you or made you think of your own ancestors? Or I like how he says the eternal grandparents is another phrase that he uses for the ancestors. Because he says they're watching over us, all those who have gone before. They are our ancestors, and they have seen enough in their own lives to know what we are going through. They've survived economic collapse, social unrest, political struggle, and great wars that raged for years. And now, from their place of peace, they seek to send their wisdom into our hearts, to guide us to reconciliation, to show us our mistakes before we make them, Their love for us is strong, their faith in us is certain, and when times get hard, sit quietly and open your spirit to the eternal grandparents who are still a part of your spiritual world. Receive their blessing, for their light will lead you home. I just thought that was a beautiful image. If you've seen Reservation Dogs, on Hulu, it's about I believe they're on an Indian reservation, and primarily a group of teenagers. But one of the teenagers is kind of, they're all going through their coming of age. But there's a beautiful episode that is like her connecting to her eternal grandparents and like the tribe of elders in the ancestor realm. Trent?
Have been thinking about the church, the Mormons, and their emphasis on relatives, and how I don't understand how their faith understands that, but I do respect that emphasis on valuing, remembering, keeping those who went before us ever before us. And it's kind of called me back to that to a certain degree.
I recently participated in I guess you'd call it like an ancestry remembrance ceremony, where you sat in silence, tried to clear your mind, and then you envisioned your father on one side of you with a hand on your shoulder and your mother on the other side. And then behind them were their father and mother on both sides. And you pictured this going back as far as you could see, your ancestry. And then you asked them for wisdom in your life and what they thought of your life. So you're kind of envisioning yourself as that ancestor, but listening for their voice. It was very powerful.
Yeah. So it is interesting what we can kind of receive or intuit or know when we give ourselves that freedom to do so. I trust that if you have something that you want to add, that you'll, Pat? The microphone. Where's James? Yeah. Sorry, for the people online, they can't hear without the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, all right, you
Thank
can hear me
you.
now. I didn't read the book,
It's
but
okay.
I'm curious about the ancestors part. Is this indigenous tradition he's talking about? And do they envision something like heaven, where the ancestors are hanging out there? Or is there, how do they imagine the ancestors?
Well, from what I've read in the book, it's like heaven is the spiritual realm, and it's not necessarily separate from us. That actually the veil is pretty thin between us and them, is what he seems to
So
suggest in
kinda
his
right
book.
here.
That what everybody else picked up on too. Yeah. So it's like heaven is just a spiritual realm that's a lot closer than we might imagine.
Good, okay, thank you.
Yeah. James is getting a workout today. Thank you, James.
I think there's something that didn't occur to me until right now that gets lost, remembering ancestors and putting that emphasis on the family that came before, because not only are you doing that for what is in the past, but you're also teaching a younger generation to remember you. So it's by honoring creating the tradition to be honored, and also kind of puts you into the state of mind of being something worth honoring.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think about all the times that my grandmother took us to the grave, the cemetery, where her family was buried in Tahlequah, and like around Memorial Day weekend, we would make that pilgrimage to go and tend to the graves. As a lot of folks raised in the South, you go to the cemetery, you take care of the graves, you put new flowers, you say hi to everybody, you have your picnic, and you go about your day. That's a tradition that I haven't kept up with my kids, but I think of it all the time. And it's like, oh, I need to do that. It's one of those things that I need to do, but I think that's how things fall away. Because if it's just always something just idealistically that we want to do, but we don't actually take the action to do it, then we're letting go little by little. Yeah. He points out the difference between tribe and nation on page 139. Because, it's almost become part of our common lexicon. You find your tribe. Hopefully St. Paul's is your tribe, but who's your tribe within St. Paul's? Are you are the common thread? Are you Dinners for 8 folks? Are you in the BBC group? Are you in the FM? We have all these smaller groups. We're these people are my tribe, right? These people get me. And that's great, and that's good. But he's saying that even beyond tribes, that there's a different, that it's important to use the word nation. He says the irony is that the original tribe, as we understood it, was a communal extended family that accepted diversity and welcomed the stranger. You see, mostly now we talk about tribes as individually, this is what we know, and it's more exclusive. But he's saying the tribe is a communally extended family, accepted diversity and welcomed the stranger. We called ourselves not a tribe, but a nation, because we understood that community can only endure when the essential cooperative unity of the tribe becomes the great family of the nation. So tribalism, from our viewpoint, means mutual respect. And without that spiritual center, without the ground of justice and equality, no nation can grow. So that's very much a difference in, our understanding of what we mean when we say tribe or nationalism today.
So I was curious when I was reading this, and also just in general, when Indians or Native Americans or First Americans refer to the term nation, are they referring to nation as in United States, or are they referring to nation as in the nation of First Americans?
I think when he's talking about nation, he's talking the Choctaw Nation, the Cherokee Nation, the Quapaw Nation, those different, the different nations of the people. But I think he makes that quick leap, even unspoken, into thinking of if we take that to mean our humanity as a nation, our nation of humans.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This really spoke to me because Casey actually describes this from the gospel this morning. So if you haven't been to church, listen up, because he talks about maybe there will be a time.
Yeah.
And it was just, you're sitting there nodding your head the whole time and thinking about how wonderful that would all be. So
Yeah.
this gentleman in the native way, First American way, may just be, I'll use the word rungs ahead of us.
Yeah, right.
In terms of collectiveness.
Yeah. It's definitely a hope for us. So, this is the ideal that when I mentioned that he talks about our encounter within the kiva or within the sweat lodge, that it needs others. It's not just about our spiritual exchange, but also our communal exchange. And he's talking about it needs that diversity. If we he doesn't really justify why we need it. I think that he's taking for granted that we assume that when we bring all of our, unique personalities and individualities together, that we learn from that diversity, like he said earlier in the book. And so when we learn from each other's experience and have that greater diversity, that we're stronger. And so we have that exchange that leads to our renewal, that kind of enlightened understanding. And then that renewal is what we need for all of life to flourish. So it's another one of his progressions that he makes in that. So this might be an exercise that you can take with you, because I was thinking about in practice. Do we enter that dark, silent place willingly? And would we be willing to? And maybe it's part of your spiritual practice, and maybe you're on a cold day and where would that be my practice? But it's an invitation. Do we enter the womb willingly, and are we willing to encounter others, encounter spirit, and be encounter with all of creation? And then would we be willing to exchange what we previously held on to for whatever is new? And what might we hope to be renewed in our life? What would be a sign of that light that we've actually experienced that renewal? So those are just kind of some, a way to kind of apply it in a spiritual practice kind of way. Kind of like that rung itself gets its own spiritual practice rather than like the whole thing, but like that kind of like with the action, there were different actions that we could take to live more fully into that place in our spiritual journey. This could maybe, it might risk taking us back to the beginning and starting over again, but it could just be knowing what I know now. So what would I take into that darkness to be transformed or renewed? I think he does that too. He slips into the transformed and renewal language. So that's just an invitation for you. So are we ready to move on to chapter 8? Chapter 8, the light is coming. And so this picture, he actually mentions the place of the Choctaw origins, like their origin story. And he says that in the Choctaw Nation, that it's actually at the place, the Naniwaya, that is the sacred mound where the first people emerged from the earth. So that's where the humans were born. This mound is actually a picture from the Plum Bayou mound near Scott, between Scott and England, Arkansas, southeast of Little Rock. And so, Arkansas has the historic mounds, but that picture is actually from an Arkansas mound. This is actually the Naniwaya mound in Mississippi that he's referring to. You can find everything on Google, right? And so in my slide presentation, I have the links to the sites where I got them from. So if you want that kind of source tracking, you can have that. But he talks about like when the first humans emerged from the light of day, this is where, like they emerged from the earth and saw the light. And so like that's the whole image, the whole reason we've been climbing the ladder is so that we can emerge from the darkness into the light. And, this is kind of the end of the book, right? It's like, well, say more about that. And he doesn't really say a whole lot about it. He just kind of reiterates some of the points that he's talked about before. This is the chapter where we get the summary that I read at the beginning. He talks about there are days when we feel strong, when we feel like we're an agent of change, but that's not always or every day, but those days do come. He offers us some good questions for the self-examine. I called it like a self-examine. Like at the end of the day, if it's part of your practice to think about kind of in an Ignatian sort of way, what have I done well? What could I do better tomorrow? He asks these questions for when we become ancestors, because one day we will become ancestors. What will those left in this reality say of us? Have we set an example for them to follow? Did we cherish the highest values of our people, and were we defenders of Mother Earth? And those are some good questions to ask when you don't have to be on your deathbed to ask them. We can ask them at the end of the day, noonday, whenever we want to reflect. We have the rite of reconciliation in the Episcopal Church. So if it's part of your practice to make your confession every so often, like these are questions that you can ask yourself to think about what maybe you might want to confess and make, to turn around, to repent and head in a new direction. So I thought that was a gift of questions like that. He talks about we do climb this ladder, and whether we climb it for a particular reason or like just the climbing of the ladder is our reason and our purpose. That the light we seek is liberation, and it's not just liberation for ourselves, it's freedom for everyone. And this is where he talks about the nearness of the spirit realm or heaven for those awake enough to see it. So he talks about the land of earth and heaven on page 153. That Patricia, you had asked about. He says, the land of earth and heaven is the title of one of his prayer reflections. And he says, into every life come moments when sound slips to silence, when motion slows to pantomime, when the hard reality of this life blurs into the softer outline of the sacred. What is holy is not distant, but imminent. What you reach for in prayer is already in the palm of your hand. We are not mystics on a lonely summit, but common laborers in the fields of wonder. Feel the presence of the Spirit in the room where you are sitting. Feel the energy of the Spirit moving around you. You have dual citizenship in a land of earth and heaven, being both now and coming to be, being made of mud and stardust, being a child who is so soon an elder. So when I think of people talking about a veil being in a thin, at a birth, at a death, in a time of trial or tragedy or crisis, when it feels like, the line between what is living and what is mortal, that boundary becomes thin. And it feels like you have a more palpable sense of spirit. If you've never had that experience, it's one of those things you can't explain or describe to somebody. You just know it when you have it, as are most of the experiences of faith. Trent.
Ever since I started reading Richard Rohr, and I hear theology of climbing a ladder, I'll always come back to his notion that it's really a ladder of descent, at least in his theology. That it's not climbing above other people and their struggles, but in a way it's climbing deeper into this common human struggle. And I think in a way it's both. There is transcendence, and yet there's also this depth of entering into this commonality that we all share. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how I haven't read his book, and I'm sorry,
That's okay.
but how that whole Richard Rohr ladder of descent versus this ladder of ascent fits in with what he's talking about.
I think that that's a risk when we use a ladder imagery at all. That's like when Jacob's ladder was last week, right? And the angels ascending and descending. That I like that it mentioned ascending and descending. Not just because like heaven is some upper realm and earth is some lower realm, but just that exchange between two places. So if we take off that horizontal view of life and make it vertical, or like just kind of change which sphere. Are we only looking at it like three-dimensional? What dimensions are we talking about here when we're talking about something we don't really understand completely? We can't see or touch it per se. But I think that the Richard Rohr image of going deeper, I think that that's kind of what he's alluding to in the Kiva. Like to think about when he says the ladder of light is, the ladder to the light is within you, is this quote on page 152, that it really is that invitation to think about what is that Kiva, what is the sweat lodge within you, what is that womb-like space that's going to, possibly germinate or give birth to your true transformation, to the light, be it the light of Christ, be it, the whatever that might be. What is that awareness that you're going to nurture and give birth to? Is that kind of, James?
So I've also kind of given some thought to this ladder just in this class right now. Yes, you're climbing up the ladder, and you reach this idea of transformation, but then maybe you have some sort of negative personal event impact you. What do you think about the concept of someone sliding back down the ladder and needing to re-climb the ladder?
That's a sequel to the book. It's called Chutes and Ladders. I'm just kidding. The Ladder to the Light, and the sub-sequel. There's a board game for that. I think, but I mean, that's when you say like, so we ascend, we are transformed, and then we have a negative encounter, and then we like, whoops. It's not like in their baptismal covenant. It's not if you sin, it's when you sin and repent and return to the Lord. So, I mean, it's not one and done. We're always going to be. I mean, I think that's part of our suffering. Trent?
Yeah, so there was this band back in the 90s called Lifehouse. And one of the lyrics in one of their songs, and I didn't realize they had Christian lyrics until I listened to them for a while, because they were played on the radio. And one of their songs said, even if I fall to the bottom of the end, I am only one step back to you. And that's always stuck with me. The whole idea of falling can be a negative thing, but it is also a humbling reorienting
Yeah.
back to you.
Yeah. No, that's a beautiful image. Thank you. I've mentioned before that the liberation is for everyone, and he names like our common struggle is to bring peace and justice and healing into our world. He kind of names it that's our collective work. He also mentions having communal balance and equilibrium. He doesn't really elaborate on it too much, but he does say that he has this invocation that he says, "I believe we're all the same." And I told you all last week that I don't like that we are all the same language. It just doesn't jive with me, so this is me putting my, agenda on here. But I did think about how could I say that and mean it with the intention that I think he means it. And so I struck it out and put Ken. I believe we are all Ken. And I could, and not Barbie Ken enough, but Ken, K-I-N. We're in Arkansas, I can say it I say it like that. But so we are all kin, we're kinship. So he gives the example of, he's from Oklahoma, so he's lived in Tornado Alley. He talks about, the Oklahoma of his youth, Jim Crow era, segregation, different segregation in the town, like Protestants and Catholics won't come together, just all the ways that they're segregated. And he said, but when a tornado comes, like everybody's seeking shelter. It doesn't matter, who you are, where you're from, what's your socioeconomic class, that you're all seeking the same shelter. And so he says, I wrote this book because we are facing a great storm. The kiva is our shelter. It is for all of us because we are all kin. He says the same, but I say kin. The kiva is our shelter. It is for all of us because we are all kin. And so when he says kiva there, like that opportunity to do the inner work is for all of us, whoever we are, and to survive that which threatens to destroy us or that which brings death, that kind of like that soulful death, that which is not life-giving, loving, and liberating. The opportunity for us to transform that, to be life-giving, loving, and liberating is for everyone. And so that's his image for that. And I thought it was a powerful one. Some more notes from the Rung of Transformation. And this is one I thought that was particularly important. The bottom, we must give one another hope by giving permission to speak of our visions, those intimate things we see when we look through the eyes of faith, when we close our eyes in the darkness and have those sparks of hope. What do we see? And sharing the vision, speaking openly, we create a channel for us to share in transformation. So when we allow ourselves to speak about things that, maybe when we're checking out in the grocery line, we won't just always, how's your heart today? I have done that to people before, but the time was right and the place was right, and that was just my intuitive move. But like when you're talking about AA, it reminded me that in a dream I had last night, there was a group of guys that were a little rougher than normal AA guys even look, but they were together and they were like arm in arm, and whatever in the dream was going up, like, maybe my subconscious is telling me. I just had one gin and tonic yesterday, but in the dream it was like I need to face my sobriety. And I joined in arm in arm with these guys. And I think we started to say the 12 steps or something. I don't know what we did together. We did something together collectively. Now I was working on this late at night before I went to bed. So that's my dream to work with. But even just sharing our dreams and visions and being willing to be vulnerable enough to say well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I need to not drink anymore. It's like, okay, well, that's something for me to work with. Or what does sobriety mean in my life? What am I, addicted to? What am I turning my attentions away from? And what do I need to turn my attentions toward? But to share vulnerably and deeply those spiritual visions that we have and thoughts that we have in a way that's like, I don't know what that means. And maybe even just me and my sharing, that maybe that speaks to somebody else and what they're experiencing or going through, and they have a moment of spark of enlightenment. Dreams aren't always literal, right? So It's what is the dream maker inviting us to consider in our lives, and particularly, I think, in our spiritual lives, in our subconscious lives, and what are we trying to bring to the collective consciousness, and that might help bring about the transformation for us all. So I think that especially in a faith community, like we're particularly suited not to just have superficial conversation all the time, that we should have conversation partners when we're going through all the stuff of life, and we can talk about what's really real for us. Matthew Gibbons, speaking of sharing, he and another person were at Crystal Bridges, and this is actually a painting that's on display in like the second contemporary art teaching box. And so I don't know how she pronounces her name, Teitzan, has this Awataba Kiva mural, and she used earth pigments to paint it. And actually beside it, because I went on Friday night real quick to look at it, beside it is a round painting that was actually done by her daughter. So her daughter is also an artist. But she used pigments of the earth to paint, and in murals are on the wall. And he talks about, like our peoples put our spiritual visions out for all to see. And so when I saw this and when I was told about it, I was like, I wonder about the depth of meaning behind this. I see Anne in the back, and so like there's probably depths and depths of meaning and symbol and just what can be taught from one painting, let alone the techniques that are used, but how it's displayed and what it might teach us and what it might speak to of her own, like spiritual insight and journey. But we're not always given the opportunities to be so like out there with our spiritual visions, but sometimes it happens. And I have to go and get ready for church, but this blessing, this blessing is one that I thought was a good one to conclude with. It's called Deepest Love. He says, "May the Spirit's peace come to you like snowfall in the night, silently and least expected, surrounding your home, covering your world, keeping you safe against all danger. May it rest upon your shoulder like the hand of an old friend, comforting and supportive, always there without the need for a single word spoken. May it lift you up like a spring storm, fresh with the scent of rain, clearing old hurts away with the winds of change, carrying your heart to heaven like a kite on the string of faith. May the Spirit's peace be with you like your deepest love, constant, steady, carrying beyond the compass of compassion to the depth of your soul, a stillness no power on earth could create or contain." And I think for him to be able to write that, he's experienced that peace that passes all understanding. Like that's the blessing that, when we say, may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts, minds, that whole blessing, like that's an image that can come to mind for you, along with whatever beautiful images that you have. And the little couple page afterwards that we have are just like his last emphasis on words of hope and encouragement, his image of a world of light. And then I love that quote from 158, let's just do some good together and see what happens. That was a good, let's just do the thing and see what happens. So that's kind of Ladder to the Light in a nutshell, terribly succinct. And I love those of you who've reached out and just said, there's been ways that things have spoken to you from the book or from our discussion and sharing in this class. And so however we can continue to nurture you in your spiritual journey and in your life of faith, that's what we're here for. And that's a great joy and privilege of mine. However we can walk with you, we're here. Let's just do some good and see what happens. Thank you all. Thank you so much.